our event by acknowledging that we're in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. Thanks so much for coming. The MacEachen Institute is now 3 years old. In 3 years, we've hosted over 100 events and welcomed over 4,000 people to these events. Our goal is to be the go-to place for public policy analysis and discussion locally and nationally. We seek to connect local concerns to the national discourse and the national discourse to local concerns. This autumn, the MacEachen Institute is hosting 11 panels on a variety of important policy topics. In an age where there are concerns over fake news and media manipulation, we want to create a platform for a thoughtful exchange of informed views. We will welcome over 40 people to campus this fall to speak on these issues that will come from a variety of professional and personal backgrounds. Our panels typically take place Tuesday, 12 to 1:30 at the Rowe Building. Next week, we will have a panel on the future of energy. The following week, reconciliation and child welfare. The week after that, climate change. We provided you with a bookmark on your seat that lists our events. Tomorrow, our panel is entitled The Future of Work, where demographics, technology, and urbanization collide. It starts at noon. Everyone's welcome to join us in person or as part of our live stream. We encourage you to bring a friend, and preferably someone with whom you like to disagree on a regular basis. All of our panels are recorded and available online at the MacEachen Institute website. Before I introduce our guests, I'll just make a small note about fire exits. 2 at the back, 2 at the side. I study emergency management, so I'd like to not be accused of not pointing that out at the beginning of every session. The role of politics and politicians is central to our public policy process and outcome. Politics gives democratic lifeblood and energy to our system. Tonight's panelists are among the most experienced in the country. They know the Atlantic Canadian terrain very well, from working in the trenches to some of the top political jobs in Canada. They know how to get things done, and they know how things can get tripped up. We asked them to join us for our discussion tonight, and we're delighted that they accepted. In the interest of full disclosure, I like them all, and I'm really glad they're here. We recognize no one's running for office. As moderator, I will not ask specific questions about any one party's current political platform. The questions will be on some of the big challenges and opportunities, the way we should think about them, and achieve a desired outcome in the medium term. Please spare a thought for the moderator. It's difficult to develop a list of questions for the limited time that we have. We have 5 topics. We could have had 50. We solicited questions online. I also consulted online polling data that identified issues that Atlantic Canadians are most concerned about. I also consulted with a number of colleagues at Dalhousie and elsewhere before finalizing tonight's questions. I shared a copy of the topics and questions with the panelists last Thursday so they would have a chance to reflect on them. I'd like to thank everyone for their input. Finally, there'll be an open mic for about 15 to 20 minutes for you to ask questions towards the end of tonight's session. I'd now like to introduce our speakers. Darrell Dexter is the former Premier of Nova Scotia, an honorary distinguished fellow at the MacEachen Institute at Dalhousie, and Vice Chair with Global Public Affairs, which he joined in 2015. Darrell assumed the leadership of the Nova Scotia Democratic Party in 2001 and led it to form the first ever provincial NDP government in Atlantic Canada, becoming the 27th Premier of Nova Scotia. As Premier, he earned praise for launching a renewable energy strategy, advancing progressive social policy, controlling spending, and reducing small taxes. Please welcome Darrell Dexter. Janice Harvey teaches in the Environmental and Society program at St. Thomas University. Before undertaking graduate studies and transitioning into academia, she worked for 25 years as Executive Director and then as Marine Program Director at the Conservation Council of New Brunswick. Dr. Harvey has been involved with the Green Party since 2008 when the New Brunswick Green Party was first formed. She served as its founding president from 2008 to 2012, and since then as the president of the Fredericton South Green Party Association. She's been active on several campaigns, both as a candidate and an organizer, including the historic campaign in 2014, which first elected Green Party leader David Kuhn to the NB legislature. She holds a Master's of Philosophy and Policy Studies and a PhD in Interdisciplinary Studies from the University of New Brunswick. Please welcome Janice Harvey. The Honourable Peter MacKay is a partner in the Baker McKenzie Toronto office. Prior to joining the firm in 2016, Peter MacKay served in the Parliament of Canada for over 18 years and in a ministerial post in the Canadian government for almost 10 years after the Conservative Party formed a government in 2006. Most recently, he served as Canada's Attorney General and Minister of Justice until November 2015, a position to which he was appointed in 2013. Prior to this post, Peter served as the Minister of National Defence for 6 years and held joint cabinet positions as Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister for the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency. Please welcome Peter MacKay. The Honourable Ann McLellan was born in Hants County, Nova Scotia, and is currently a senior advisor at Bennett Jones in Edmonton. Prior to joining Bennett Jones, she had a distinguished career in federal politics, where she served 4 terms as Liberal Member of Parliament for Edmonton Centre from 1996 to 2006. Ms. McClelland provides national and international strategic planning assistance to the firm's clients. She's also, of course, the Chancellor of Dalhousie University. During her political career, Ms. McLellan was Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, Minister of Health, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and Minister of Natural Resources and Federal Interlocutor for Métis and Non-Status Indians. As Deputy Prime Minister, she chaired 2 cabinet committees, the Operations Committee and the Security, Public Health and Emergencies Committee. Please welcome Ann McLellan. So our format tonight is pretty simple and hopefully a little bit disciplined. I'm going to ask questions of our panelists, and we're going to have a discussion for about 12 minutes on each topic, which is going to be a little bit tricky, but that's as much as we could afford given the time constraints. So 4 topics, 12 minutes on each topic. Caitlin Lowe from the MacEachen Institute and Taria Jadi from the MacEachen Institute are going to keep us on time. I'm going to signal to me when they're at 10 minutes, and I'm going to try to bring them in for a landing at 12. So if we can stick to 12 minutes, then we'll get through all of our questions, and if not, then we're going to have a little bit of a challenge. We have reserved a last question for the last few minutes that will go a little bit beyond the 4 times 12, 48. Before we start, however, I wanted to give every panelist an opportunity to take a couple of minutes to address this first question, as I say, before we get to the first question. And we're going to start with Ann McLellan, and we're going to work our way this way with this first question. So everyone's going to get 2 minutes to answer this question. Based on your experience, and at this particular juncture, what do you think the most important issue is for Atlantic Canadians, and why?
I think the most pressing, am I on? Okay. I think the most pressing issue right now when we're considering medium-term or long-term issues is people. Atlantic Canada simply doesn't have enough of them. We are faced with 2 curves that are on a collision course, a declining population curve in this region, and then a curve that speaks to the percentage of older Atlantic Canadians in that declining population. And that's a collision course. That's unsustainable. And this isn't new, I am sure, to anyone in this room. So where does that lead us in terms of medium and long-term solutions? Answers, I think, to immigration. And to me, in this election, people in this region should be talking to their leaders about how we reverse that curve and how we ensure that we have sensitive, smart immigration policies that bring new Canadians here, who bring their skills, their entrepreneurial spirit, and so on. And I would say as well that along with immigration, it's many things, but we also need successful integrative policies, the resources to make sure that when people come here, they are welcomed, they are integrated, they are included, they have the things they need to succeed. No one in this audience has not heard of Peace by Chocolate. Great thing about Peace by Chocolate, obviously Syrian refugees. But you know the other great thing, ladies and gentlemen? They didn't settle in Halifax. They went to Antigonish.
Central Nova.
They went to, you're right. They went to Antigonish because part of our challenge is, in fact, making sure that new Canadians, immigrants, are welcomed in small towns in rural Atlantic Canada because, in fact, Halifax is booming. We even have an affordability crisis in terms of housing. But we need immigrants to feel welcome in the rest of Atlantic Canada. And I use Peace by Chocolate as a great example of a refugee family who left who went to a small town, Canada, and succeeded. And that's what we need. I've worked out, I know, time's up. I have worked out, we need 500,000 piece by chocolates in the Atlantic region.
There you go.
And Anne's going to treat everybody to chocolate after tonight. I agree with Anne. In fact, we agree on a lot of things, which I came to discover quickly after going to Ottawa. And in fact, the people issue for sure. But there's subsets of issues, I'm sure, that we can all quickly identify. And it's the retention and attraction. So, yes, immigration, but also what I would call repatriating Atlantic Canadians. Those who would love to come back home if there was a job. So it's employment. And the Peace by Chocolate example was they created a niche. And we're seeing this with interesting things, microbreweries. We're seeing it in different tech industries where it isn't, I say with respect, it isn't incumbent that it be based in Halifax or any larger center. We're seeing more and more our ability to innovate in the new economy. The ocean creates a huge opportunity that we could be capitalizing on. And this university and others are doing a lot in this ocean cluster. And many of the world's biggest economies, of course, are based on the water. And so there's a lot more that can be done with respect to capitalizing on our geography here in Atlantic Canada. So all of this combines in what I consider to be an enormous opportunity, or perhaps the flip side is its potential we haven't quite yet tapped into. Bringing people back to Atlantic Canada, making our economy more affordable, more attractive. That may involve at some point looking at sort of innovative out-of-the-box things. A place where they're doing that is Volta here in Halifax. ACOA, of course, works very closely with them. I had the good fortune to be in that portfolio and see some of the really important work that's done to help capitalize young entrepreneurs who are starting off, who can't get that initial startup, and they're working out of their parents' basement. Another great example here in Nova Scotia was these great T-shirts that you see everywhere now, which were a wonderful invention, if you will, at Acadia University, where a young man decided that this was something he was going to do, took out into the world. It helped that Sidney Crosby wore one on Hockey Night in Canada. So capitalizing on the opportunities here, putting the focus back on people, on retention, and on trying to open up the economy here for some of those new opportunities.
Thank you. Janice.
Well, it will come probably as no surprise that for me the most important issue is the climate emergency. And if anybody's been paying attention in the past, 40 years, but let's be more sort of up to date and think about the last week or so. The scientific reports just keep coming. There was just another one released yesterday in the run-up to the UN summit on climate change that is happening today. The youth climate strike movement, 4 million people on the streets last Friday, mostly youth. We can think that somehow Atlantic Canada is immune from all of that, that whatever we do here is not going to make a difference, but we're being hammered. Every year, governments in Atlantic Canada are paying millions and millions of dollars in recovery from climate damage. We have to get to half our greenhouse gas emissions in 11 years, and we have to get to zero by 2050. Atlantic Canada is part of that challenge. And while our emissions are relatively small, I think Maritimers want to go there. They want renewable energy. They want solar on their roofs. They want energy-efficient houses. They want great public transit. They want a renewed passenger train system. They want local organic food. All of this stuff is building resilience in Atlantic Canada to stand us in better stead when the storms come. And the storms are inevitable. They're going to get worse as we go. And the more money we pour into storm recovery, repairing the damage, the less money we're going to have. All of the other policy files become more difficult. Time's
Darrell.
up.
The dangers of going last. I'm going to jump off from where Anne and Peter were talking. It's not working?
have you got your mute
You're
button?
muted, probably, Darrell. Up at the top.
Now, is that better? Ah, okay. Not a speech on technology, right?
That's later.
So I'm going to jump off a little bit from where Ann and Peter were talking, because I think the largest challenge that we have in the region right now is our demography. When I was in high school, the median age in this region was 24. The median age today is 46. In fact, the median age of people who are going to vote in the upcoming election is 52. The baby boom generation are leaving the workforce. And in fact, the workforce numbers are actually down across the region. This is going to impact our economy. It's going to impact our ability to be able to support the kind of social services, the kinds of programs that we would like to have in the region. It's going to impact on the life of communities. It is going to impact virtually every aspect of our life, including our ability to be able to address important issues like climate change. We're simply not going to have the resources to be able to deal with those. Immigration is part of the answer to that, but we would have to increase our level of immigration many fold over what it is today. What I like to tell people is that the answer to the demographic challenges that we face is not a silver bullet. It is, if anything, silver buckshot. It is a bunch of things that need to happen in a lot of different places in order for our economy to be able to support the kind of community, the kind of province that we want to live in.
If I could just pick up on that, because I think that a lot of the ideas that we're talking about here and a lot of the issues that have been identified, looking at the Ivany report, looking at the recent Halifax partnership work that's been done, they do shine a light on various buckshot that we can bring about. But there's also this big urban-rural divide, and it's happening elsewhere, but it's particularly acute in a province like Nova Scotia, where Halifax, as Ann said, is doing relatively well compared to a lot of places. But follow a school bus through rural Guysborough County or parts of Cape Breton or Yarmouth, and we're losing a youthful population, and people are having fewer kids. And so there are some really systemic issues that are going to catch up to us quickly in terms of the demographic and the pressure that Darrell speaks of that's going to be on our ability to deliver health care to rural communities, our ability to address rising waters and changes in the climate. All of that is going to take not just investment, but a new way of thinking outside the box, but getting rid of the box and actually looking at technology and some of the answers that are there, starting with getting everybody online in the entire province.
I think you're the first person to mention the words healthcare in the answer, so you win the prize for that, because that's our first question. We want to talk about healthcare, so let's get to healthcare. The context for health, so what we're going to do at this stage, we're having a 12-minute discussion around healthcare, and we're going to start with Darrell Dexter, who's going to give us some opening thoughts, and then it's people can contribute as they see fit to this one. But I'll set up the context a little bit. Atlantic Canada has a higher incidence of chronic illness, such as high blood pressure, diabetes, arthritis, cancer, obesity, heart disease, and respiratory disease than the rest of Canada. In Nova Scotia, for example, 68% of Nova Scotians have a chronic illness. Medical care costs for treating chronic disease account for 60% or $1.25 billion of the total annual medical care expenditure in Nova Scotia. Estimated loss in productivity totals $1.79 billion. The overarching context is that our health is getting poorer with a larger older demographic and a less healthy younger demographic, while we're becoming less able as a region to pay for services and technologies that are becoming more expensive to provide. The conceit of Canadian healthcare is that there's only one level of citizenship for everyone, but in practice some are wondering how this region can continue to afford to meet the needs of the population. So our question is, how do we address our healthcare challenges in this region? Do we need more private healthcare? Do we need a different funding arrangement with Ottawa? If so, how would you make that case? Darrell, you want to start us off?
Sure. So I'm going to continue on with just some of the statistics that bear out what you're saying, which is, in 2019, the first baby boomers turned 73. In our province, the number of people over the age of 75 is about 8% of the population. Over the next 15 years, that's going to more than double. We're going to get to about 17% of our people being over the age of 75. We're going to exceed 30% of people over the age of 65. And these have consequences in terms of the cost of the services that have to be delivered. Currently, our province spends somewhere in the order of about 14% of our GDP on healthcare funding. Over the next 15 years, that will rise to about 20% of the GDP. At that point, it simply becomes unsustainable. We cannot afford, in a small, poor province, to be able to spend that kind of money on one program. Unfortunately, the federal government has diminished its role in healthcare funding over time. The current formula sets increases in healthcare funding at the nominal growth in the GDP, or 3%, which acts as a floor. What it means is it does not keep pace with the actual cost increase in healthcare. So the federal role diminishes every year. What we need, obviously, is a new funding formula. If Atlantic Canadians are going to be entitled to reasonably the same level of service at reasonably the same level of taxation as is guaranteed in our Constitution, then the federal government is going to have to come back to the table and properly fund it.
So the view from Ottawa on this?
Darrell has pointed out, healthcare is expensive.
Mike?
But
Mike?
if you're looking, sorry. Healthcare is expensive, and our expectations continue to grow, both in this region and across the country. But I would just say a couple of things, and they're not magic bullets, but things that we really need to take on board. One is making sure that our healthcare professionals are working to the full extent of their scope of practice. This is not happening, and therefore we are wasting the productive capacity of many healthcare professionals. Pharmacists are trained to do a lot more than in many provinces they're allowed to do. Nurse practitioners should become an integral part of healthcare delivery and service around the world, around the country, not only north of 60, right? Or in a remote Aboriginal community in northern Alberta where I live. I mean, I was federal minister of health, and I know full well every province wants more money from the government of Canada, and I understand that.
That's our job.
But, yeah, that's your job. And my job is to say, hey, no, there is no more, right? But we usually always gave you more. But look, scope of practice has been an issue for a very long time, and we are wasting the cost of the education that these people are given, and they could be doing so much more in the healthcare system. The other thing I will say is prevention. Here I'm putting a plug in for DAL. Big research project, but not only DAL, other universities, healthcare providers, healthcare professionals, the Integrative Health Research and Innovation Strategy, where this is the next, oceans you mentioned, the next big thing for DAL, if we get this right, is that innovative research and innovation strategy. And what that's going to do is take this province and use it as a case study in terms of how we reform healthcare in a nimble and agile way, using all the components. And part of it is prevention. Getting our healthcare professionals to keep people healthy from the time they are born, as opposed to seeing someone when they're have a chronic or acute condition when they are the most expensive to the healthcare system. We will not, I don't care where we live, here or somewhere else in Canada, we will not sustain healthcare unless we start to do those kinds of things which are not a magic bullet but have to be done.
Janice, go ahead.
So let me just put a few points on the table. First of all, our healthcare system was not designed for long-term chronic disease management. It was built for acute illnesses and trauma. And so we really need a redesign of the system in order to deal with this new reality that we're dealing with. Not only chronic diseases, but also mental health, increases in mental illness. So 3 priorities for me. We do have to renegotiate with the federal government the funding model. It simply is not fair as it is now organized. We have to get away from those growth metrics and focus on need. Where is the need? And that has to do with aging populations, of course. It also has to do with health indicators. And I'll get to that in a minute, but I would say that that how we get that is we need a united front of Atlantic premiers. And the example I would put on the table is how we got equalization. That was a united front in the 1950s, early 1960s. All of the Atlantic premiers developed a common agenda around equalization and took it to Ottawa, and eventually it became institutionalized. It became, it's in the Constitution. That's how we have to operate, I think, to be effective in Ottawa. The other thing we have to invest in, however, in terms of prevention, of course, but poverty is the single largest social determinant of poor health. And we have to be committing to poverty reduction. We have to be looking at things like guaranteed livable incomes. We have to be looking at universal pharmacare and dental care. Things like that are going to work to alleviate some of those social determinants of health, especially poverty reduction. And then the model, so the collaborative care community health centers. That is where we're starting to see the effective treatment and management of chronic diseases. And there are various examples of those. I think there are half a dozen in New Brunswick that are now operating, where a team of health professionals are caring for the whole person and for families across a whole range of needs, including mental health and addiction. So we really have to rethink the whole focus of healthcare systems. We have to redesign systems. We have to go back to Ottawa as a united front, and we have to reduce poverty.
I want to bring in Peter MacKay on this point because Janice has referenced issues around poverty and chronic illness, et cetera. Is there a particular urban-rural lens to apply to this, Peter, that makes this even more severe? Because it seems the data in those categories around income and health are even worse in rural areas.
There's no question when you go to rural parts of the country, and it's evident that many of these regional hospitals have been forced to close. And you know, I really do wrap my arms around this idea of the collaborative approach, and we could talk about a whole range of issues where Atlantic Canada should be, regardless of who's in office, should be approaching Ottawa as a group.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's how we should be marketing ourselves to the world. And Darrell and I have been on the world stage at times when you talk about Atlantic Canada as opposed to New Brunswick, PEI, Newfoundland, Labrador, and Nova Scotia. And I think that is also something that will help us make the case. But, you know, rural Canada has been hearing for a long time telehealth. We're going to be able to address a lot of these issues through new technologies, and we'll be able to diagnose over the internet. We've never quite reached that panacea, and it's exacerbated by the fact that a lot of places are still not online. And so that is a bridge too far at this point for many parts in Canso and parts of Nova Scotia. Both ends of the spectrum are getting pinched. Yes, the prevention part and in schools, and New Brunswick has a very innovative breakfast program which addresses some of the issues of kids being in school hungry, not being able to get their education, an upfront investment there. I like the old participation program, and if we put more emphasis and revived that and got kids, you know, thinking about active living and talking about it in a way, you know, and the private sector, of course, has to be involved. Canadian Tire with this Jumpstart program, that's all great stuff. Seniors on the other end of the spectrum are having a very hard time because they are feeling the effects of aging. Their healthcare problems become more acute, and they can't get to Halifax, or they can't even get to the regional hospital in some cases. So yes, more investment. It has to happen beyond just simple escalators. that are formulaic and don't address outmigration in provinces like ours. And certainly the province can make the case for we need MRIs. We need a specific strategy that addresses our specific needs, which may not be the same in Northern Alberta as it is in the Maritimes. So Ottawa is going to have to be more flexible, there's no question, and that is the quintessential Canadian definition in many eyes of what makes us different and apart and attractive as a society, is that we are to take care of everyone with universal health care.
Darrell, let me ask you before you ask, you say, what about the more collaborative approach across the region? The premiers working hand in hand?
I feel like I've been waiting for that question.
Yeah, working hand in hand. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention to Peter that I think I still have my participation badge somewhere.
Award of Excellence.
You've got a minute.
The Collaborative Emergency Centers were created right here in Nova Scotia out of the work of Dr. John Ross. It was taken from Nova Scotia and became part of the Healthcare Innovation Working Group through the Council of Federation, and then was shared across the country. It was a fair amount of pride for me because Saskatchewan was one of the provinces that first decided to take on the new CECs, and for me, Saskatchewan, which was the home of Medicare, where Tommy Douglas brought that program first forward, it was symbolic for me that Nova Scotia could move an innovation in Medicare back to Saskatchewan.
But what about collaboration coming out of Team Atlantic Canada to Ottawa, a joint approach?
Well, as I'm saying, that's why the Council of Federation, not just the Atlantic approach, but across the country, we shared all the best practices among the provinces in order to find out what was working in other parts of the country. Atlantic Canada has very specific issues around demography, as I mentioned, and it is not a mystery. CIHI keeps all the statistics on the costs associated with an aging population. You can go and look them up. If you're over, the average cost per year for per capita over 75 is about $23,000 as opposed to $6,000 for someone under the age of 65. This data is readily available. We know what the costs are. It's not going to be a mystery.
I have to go on to my next question. Okay.
I just have to say, here I wear my Ottawa hat,
All right.
right? Look, this
Tari's not very happy. Tari's not very happy with you.
Anyway,
but, okay.
this region is over-governed.
Okay.
So why don't we talk about things like provincial unification?
Ooh.
See? Wow. Right. Exactly.
Last question, state of democracy, Ann.
Sorry.
You can bring it up for state of
Good.
democracy.
I'm coming back to that because,
All right.
boy.
Okay.
Well, we've had 2 doctors as premiers in this province within our recent past, with great respect to Darrell. We've had a lawyer too. But it's been a high priority here for a very long time.
Let's move on to infrastructure and the environment, and Janice Harvey is going to start us on this question. Hurricane Dorian blew through the region a little over 2 weeks ago. At its peak, over 400,000 people lost power in Nova Scotia, which represents approximately 80% of households and businesses in the province. In Prince Edward Island, it's reported that 75% of customers were without power, and 20% of customers in New Brunswick also lacked power. Cell phone coverage and internet were also widely unavailable. Much of our critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector, particularly when we talk about what we call the iron triangle of infrastructure: telecoms, banking, and power supply. So the question is, experts believe that events like Dorian are likely to be more common and perhaps even bigger and more devastating. What changes to governance do we need to address future risks to our critical infrastructure?
Happy to talk about this, put a few things on the table. The governance focus is interesting. I would say I'm from New Brunswick. Our power utility is public, right? It's not private. And so I'm going to get away from whether it's public or private in my comments here, because I think we've got some good examples on both sides that are not stellar. But first of all, I think in terms of governance, we need to elect governments who actually take this seriously, who understand the kind of long-term planning that has to be done. But the first thing that we really need to do is define critical infrastructure. What is it? Where is it? Who owns it? And that definition needs to be in the context of public safety and public services. So let's define critical infrastructure and map it. The provincial governments, I think, need to take the lead on this with federal assistance, of course. But we're talking about electricity grids, we're talking about transportation links, rail and road, we're talking about telecommunications, and I would add that we're also looking at emergency medical response systems. Not sure about the banks. Was that
So,
one that you said?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's referred to as the iron triangle, but I take your point that there are different ways to define critical
Yeah,
infrastructure.
I mean,
That's true.
I think we have to come from a public services, public safety perspective and identifying that. Now, in New Brunswick, that has been done for coastal infrastructure, and I would suggest we really need to do it for all critical infrastructure. So we map it, we identify it, but then we have to do a risk assessment for each individual installation that we have identified as critical. And we need a public process then for identifying what level of risk is acceptable to the public. Because if the process would be then to de-risk that critical infrastructure. But to what extent? To what level? And who's going to say what level of risk is acceptable or not? I think that's a public discussion. I think it's something that we all have to be part of. And then we have to legislate standards, right? We have to legislate standards for risk reduction, and it doesn't matter whether it's publicly owned or privately owned, those standards have to be met. And this is once we have decided as a community that these are critical infrastructure. So the point here is that there needs to be public accountability for the maintenance of critical infrastructure, and that infrastructure is built, operated, maintained at a level that is going to minimize risk. Now, the cost of that, who pays? That's the cost of doing business.
Let me ask
right?
you a follow-up question. Do you think that we can come to a stable understanding of say, risk tolerance, like what we're willing to put up with or prioritizing risk? Because one of the things we saw here with Dorian, it seemed to me that the community responded largely pretty well, way better than Hurricane Juan, right? We've come a long way. But still there's a lot of ranting and raving the next morning about, my phone doesn't work.
Right.
So can you have a sort of civil discussion in a town hall about how to prioritize these things? Then there's the event itself,
Yep.
when everyone goes a little haywire. How do you manage that discrepancy?
Well, I think it has to be a public discussion. I think governments have to take the lead, and we have to start public discussions about that. What level of risk is tolerable? And the lower the risk, of course, the higher the cost in terms of de-risking your infrastructure, if you want to use that term. So there's a public discussion to be had, and there's always going to be people who are unhappy one way or the other. But if we take the focus of public safety and public service as our determining factors for making sure that infrastructure will withstand the worst abuses of these storms that come, that services will be restored as within a really reasonable amount of time, that nobody is going to be put not at inconvenience, but certainly in harm's way or their health compromised. Those are the sorts of, we haven't had these discussions. We're playing catch up now, right? Climate change is barreling down on us. We have Dorian and Fredericton, the last two springs, Fredericton has been underwater. The whole lower St. John River 2 years ago was flooded. And we're reacting. We're constantly reacting to this stuff. We have to be proactive now. We know what's coming. We've been warned. And we also know from a report that was just released, reported on by Bloomberg, that that the cost of infrastructure resilience, building infrastructure resilience, is about $1.7 trillion globally for dealing with this. On the other hand, the expectation is that for that $1.7 trillion investment, $7 trillion will be avoided in costs if we do that. These are big questions, and we're just not having the conversations. We
And
have to go there.
You're
I was
nodding,
just
and you're
gonna
also
say,
Minister
I
of
agree
Public
with Janice.
Safety at one
Yeah,
point.
I was Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. And for the very reason Janice has indicated, the two were put together because you want a public safety lens on your emergency preparedness. In the Government of Canada, after 9/11, we started to map critical infrastructure across the country with the provinces, territories, and the private sector, because that was a big wake-up call for all of us. Now, driven by terrorism, or the prospect of terrorism, or the possibility, not natural disaster. But it doesn't really matter where your threat to critical infrastructure comes from. So that work has begun. And it is key that the private sector is part of this. The public sector, and Ottawa did, and it was carried forward by the Harper government, put money in to bring people together, to begin the dialogue, the consultation, the conversations. But you have to map, and that's what the goal is, every piece of critical infrastructure in this country, determine who is responsible for it, and maybe, you know, you're right, Janice, each one of those pieces of critical infrastructure will have a standard, either imposed by the industry or the regulator or whoever, but also very important to ensure that that critical infrastructure is being maintained. To give you one example of how difficult these discussions will be going forward in terms of infrastructure and protection of infrastructure and natural disaster, when you start to map floodplains all over this country and start talking to people because of the potential of a natural disaster, that they should no longer live where they've lived their whole lives. If you want to see a community engage very quickly with government, those are the kinds of issues. But Janice is right. Those are the kinds of issues, and government's got to take the leadership in terms of beginning the discussions. Otherwise, government and you as taxpayers will simply repeat over and over again, repairing homes that shouldn't be built in certain areas, or whatever else the case may be. And we can't afford that. It's not fair to the individuals, it's not fair to taxpayers, but those are really difficult emotional discussions to have with people.
Other thoughts?
They're jarring, they're expensive, but they're absolutely necessary. And it's going to happen incrementally, which is what we have seen over the history. And climate change, terrorist attacks, floods, you know, environmental anomalies that we have seen even in this city, White Wan, we weren't prepared. And what is increasingly obvious, what I see, again, back to this urban-rural, is that a lot of people are taking sort of preventative steps themselves. They're getting generators. They're looking for certain backup systems. They're banding together in some communities to try to address some of the specifics. If there's a dike that's going to be breached, there's certain communities where we have seen the military and the reservists called out, which is a really proud, unifying moment in the face of real difficulty when you see how people do rally around and you see the response in the emergency times. But it's like healthcare in the sense that the prevention pays massive dividends if we're able to map it out, to look at the risk assessment, prioritize. But therein lies the problem, and I'm going to follow a little along Anne's discussion of the political imperative, is a government, if they're a majority, has 4 years. And, we talked earlier about healthcare. There's other competing, real, difficult interests in having certain things on your to-do list, and risk assessments of a floodplain in Manitoba may not get to the top of that list by the end of your 4-year mandate, or less if it's a minority government. And then, again, the discussions with the province are also a huge part of this, because then it's, well, we'll pay this percentage if you're willing to put in this. Bring the private sector in. Here in Nova Scotia, this recent experience with Dorian, I frankly heard more from people in the community about the fact that their cell service was down.
Right.
And they weren't going to be able to cook over or have a shower if they plugged their phone into their electrical grid. But this is, again, shifting priorities. If it was February, I don't think you would have heard that discussion. It would have been around our heat and our ability to stay warm.
Darrell?
So I think the mapping and the inventory question is one that we would all agree on, and it's you know, fundamental part of being prepared. I guess the pitch that I would make is simply that governments, whether they're federal or provincial, need to get on with this work immediately, because as coastal provinces, we are going to bear the outsized effect of climate change. As sea level rises, the questions associated with flooding are going to become more and more severe. And I remember being up on the Tantramar marshes and seeing an abateau. I don't know if everybody knows what an abateau is, but it had been washed right out of the marsh, and it seems obvious to me that you know this is a substantial risk for the province of Nova Scotia, hanging off the end of the North American continent as we do, and so we could very well face the possibility of being an island.
But it's instructive, Darrell, and I think it's also inspirational to think that the Acadians built those dikes without the benefit of modern excavators and machinery, and they were able to control and in some ways capture for their own use lands, wetlands, lowlands in this province. And so it can be done if it's a priority, if it's an imperative, and if we can again rally the forces to collaborate.
I guess I was responding a little bit to your use of the word anomaly, because I don't see them as anomalies anymore. I see them as a kind of, you know, we know it's inevitable. There are inevitabilities now, and we need to be prepared to deal with those inevitabilities.
Sure.
Exactly.
Let's shift to environment and economy. And Peter MacKay is going to start us off with this one. So since 2017, there have been approximately 20 deaths of North Atlantic right whales near the Gulf of St. Lawrence. This is significant as the population is considered to be endangered, with less than 400 whales remaining in the population. In many cases, they've been caught up in fishing gear and struck by vessels and shipping lines. Part of the challenge of protecting this endangered species is that their migration is changing and is no longer predictable. This has been very disruptive to local fishers who had to pull their gear when whales are present. This is one example of how climate change may affect local economies and the uncertainty about how climate change will manifest itself. So the question is, in the face of uncertainty and changing climate, how do we transition to new environmental standards? And as with all precautionary approaches, who pays for it?
So, I mean, the Federal Department of Fisheries, in this particular case, is certainly seized of the issue. And at the risk of sounding like you're giving this a glancing blow, this is a massive issue for fishers on both coasts, and of course, there's inland fisheries as well. Part of the answer, is technology. I mean, we can track whales like never before. We can track those massive mammals in the ocean and pinpoint their location, and in many cases they travel in pods. So we could lessen the frequency with which we have seen our fishery collide, literally, with whales and other species, causing massive environmental harm and also disrupting the livelihood. Because it is constantly this discussion around balancing, especially when the environment is involved. And so I would say the same of other industries. It's remarkable to me now to see that our farmers, our ag sector, are aided by satellite mapping of where to plant, when to plant, the type of technology that they can use to maximize crop rotation. That is also, of course, impacted by climate change and what we are seeing happening in certain markets. You know, that, and there's a whole other discussion about how we have, in my opinion, underutilized opportunities to market Canadian products, Atlantic Canadian products, to other markets with free trade agreements that we have in the European Union, with free trade agreements hopefully in the future with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We're not there yet. We're not really as competitive as we should be. And so technology is part of the answer. We need to grow our economy, which helps us pay for healthcare, which helps us pay for emergency response, which gives us the ability to build infrastructure, to build a better, more attractive, competitive, productive economy. So we are doing a lot of things in Atlantic Canada. I loved the initiative. Again, we haven't quite cracked that particular nut or that atom when it comes to the energy on the ocean floors and wave technologies. And they're doing amazing things in the Bay of Fundy, and they have been for now 100 years, but we're not there yet. That's going to require more investment, and it's going to frankly require the equivalent of 3P type investment of getting the private sector to also buy into some of this necessary investment. And the universities are the incubators for so much of this discussion.
Janice, do you want to develop this?
Sure. So who pays? The premise of regulation is always, of any sort, is that it's the cost of doing business, right? And if you're doing business in a way that benefits from accessing public resources or interacts with the commons in some way, then the obligation is there to not harm those public resources or the commons. And that's what regulation is about, right? It's about identifying the public interest, the public purpose. And these goals presumably are widely shared by society, that society wants businesses to be regulated. And so that's kind of a sort of a premise, I think, that we need to start with. If we look at the whales, we look at species at risk legislation, there is an inherent assumption that we are not going to allow species to go extinct. That's the whole premise of a species. And so we look at the right whales. And they're on the edge, right? They're on the brink. And so we have to decide, really, are we willing to actually fulfill the obligation that is inherent in species at risk legislation to avoid and prevent species from going extinct? And if we are, then we have to do everything that's possible to prevent that. That absolutely comes to how are humans interacting with these whales, and what are we prepared, if we're prepared to save the whales, we've got to pull back. I think that's just a conclusion that you get to when you go down that road. Now,
on the question of who pays, though, do you not get to? Is the question then some sort of insurance program, public insurance program, or private insurance program to manage the risks? Because it would seem from a risk standpoint, that's what you would do. You'd create some sort of public or private insurance to manage the risks, because otherwise it seems to me the fishers are paying or carrying that risk.
Yeah. Well, okay, so if you were, obviously the fishers are not harvesting whales.
Not our fishers, some were.
No, some are,
Right.
Some are. And so you can't sort of to expect that they are going to carry the full burden of the cost of preventing those whales from going extinct. I think there is a public obligation to assist private enterprise, it doesn't, whether it's fishers or whatever it is, to ensure that the obligation, the public obligation, is met. So I think there are, it is legitimate to provide support to fishers to change. And I would say, what I've heard from scientists is that you can't track whales, at least not right whales. The technology does not exist to track those whales, but perhaps the technology exists to go to no-line gear, right? So maybe we're using similar technology, but in that case to identify where the fishing gear is, and as opposed to having buoys on the line.
Regulation is part of it, but also
So-
enforcement. So having more Coast Guard, more Department of Fisheries and Oceans on the water to see that we are protecting the species.
What about the
it's-
transition from the carbon economy and these notions, Darrell? What do you think about that? Those sort of big
So-
societal changes that maybe we have to make or think about.
Right. So And this is where, if you look at this issue more broadly, the government has broad regulatory powers which you can use for the public good. You can use those powers to force sectors to take certain actions. We've already done it in fuel standards, for example, with cars. There's lots of different ways that we go about doing it. The issues for governments, of course, is always that question of who pays, because ultimately the consumer or the taxpayer in many cases pays. And so we had this experience in Nova Scotia, so we brought forward the first renewable electricity plan, moved the province's utility by regulation off of fossil fuels onto renewables. That had a cost associated with it. That made people very unhappy. And politicians know, because we all read in detail the crosstabs of polling, and we know that affordability is a huge issue for people. And so when you get this intersection of affordability and regulation, that creates tremendous challenges. And it takes some strength on behalf of governments to be able to accept the expenditure of the political capital that it takes to be able to make those decisions.
And are the debates a little different in Alberta on this topic?
They're not concerned about the whales, I'm sure.
No,
as
that's
much.
right. We're not concerned about whales. No, I actually don't think they are. And for me, this is about societal values, right? And I think you mentioned, Janice, in terms of the endangered species legislation. In that legislation, it's federal legislation, is embedded a set of values around humans, how humans engage with the natural world. If we have made the commitment as a society, and there have to be costs involved, that we do not want to see species like the right whale disappear, or the woodland caribou where I live, and the burrowing owl in southern Alberta and Saskatchewan. I believe, it's not, to your point, it can be contentious, but I do believe as a society, we have determined through the endangered species legislation what our broadly based frame or set of values are in relation to how we engage with the natural world. Yes, there are costs involved, and those costs have to be worked out. Some of those costs should be borne by us as a society through the tax base, whether it's provincial, municipal, or federal. Others of those costs have to be normal regulatory fees to do business. So there is a collaboration, there's a balance to be struck, and Darrell is right that can get really contentious. You know, if you talk to some in the oil and gas industry in Alberta, or probably offshore Newfoundland, they would say that they're being taxed to death in terms of all these regulatory fees and what have you. But I think we just have to, and they have to understand that there are costs of doing business, just as governments have to understand that not all the costs can be laid off or downloaded on the private sector.
But the cost of doing business and the political capital that needs to be spent, it does come back to one undeniable truth, and this is going to get controversial, but you have to be able to generate wealth. And you have to be able to employ people, or the other endangered species is going to be people in this province. And so a pipeline, for example, coming from Alberta and Saskatchewan, being refined in a place like St. John, New Brunswick, which is operating at about 40%, exporting highly regulated, highly ethical oil and gas, some may disagree, and exporting that to the world, so that we can generate the ability to invest in new technologies to help transition to the green economy. But in the meantime, we're going to be using fossil fuels for probably the next 40 to 50 years. Why not use a Canadian product with value added, rather than bringing it from Iran or Venezuela or Russia or China or places, you know, we know are doing far more to harm the environment? But we've got to be engaged. We cannot, you know, at the risk of sounding insensitive, we cannot stop a major project because they have found one burrowing owl. They can relocate the owl. They can. No, but it really is, there really is a sensible, practical way in which you can, and we've heard this mantra for years, that protecting the environment can also allow the economy to grow, including the oil and gas sector. We're here in this beautiful room, this auditorium, the Irving Auditorium. You know, so we have to be conscious of the realities, and we are over-regulated. I heard Anne or someone say we're over-governed. We have too much government in some cases. You can streamline regulation and be able to get things done.
Sure. Janice.
But let's look at some other statistics. So
we're over time, by the way, but go ahead, please go ahead.
You probably saw the news report this week that we have 3 billion fewer birds in North America today than we had in 1970. We have hundreds of species on endangered species lists, both in provinces and federally. Overall, we have lost 60% of all wildlife in wildlife globally over the past 40 years. So our trade-offs are not serving wildlife very well. So just to put that in perspective, the reality is on oil and gas, we have to get off of it. That's what the science says. Climate change is we can't negotiate that. And it doesn't matter where the oil comes from, it still has greenhouse gas emissions attached to it. We have to get off of it. We have to be at net zero emissions in 2050. So
but we're not the problem.
No,
Canada's not the problem.
Oil and gas is the problem. It doesn't matter where it's consumed or by whom.
I want to go on to the next question. Peter, you got the last word. You started. You finished.
Well,
he finished. He started it.
Well,
we're going to come back to you next, Anne.
It does matter, and it is. You're right. We do have to get off fossil fuel. But when China's building more coal-fired generators, when we are bringing in oil and gas products that we know are not ethically produced and are not conscious of anything to do with the environment and have no regulations in places like Saudi Arabia and Iran, it is the problem. And how do we afford to transition to this new panacea, this new green economy, if we turn off all the lights, walk around in the dark, eat organic beets in our bare feet, and do all the things we're supposed to do in Canada? That'll be less than 2% of global emissions.
That was the
Canada's not the problem. We could plant more trees, do all kinds of things.
Let's we've got to move on. We've got to move on. And the question's to you, Anne. The question's to you.
I am sorry. We have to do our fair share. That's how I see this.
We're doing it.
And that's why I reject
our
the arguments.
emissions are going like this. Yeah. That's not our fair share.
No, but we have to
and a carbon tax isn't going to fix it.
What our fair share will be as a developed, prosperous nation. And I don't buy the fact that because we're only 2% of the problem, we should do nothing. We need to do our fair share, and we need reasonable tools and a variety of tools to deal with this problem. And
I'm shocked to hear an Albertan say that, because we're shutting down an entire industry.
No, we're not.
Yes, we are.
And that's what we in Alberta actually believe, that we should do our fair share. And we want a pipe, but we don't want the pipe first and foremost to St. John. We want that pipe to Burnaby so we can actually export our resources to Asia.
And let Atlantic Canada starve in the dark.
My timekeepers are going to talk to me tomorrow if we don't move on. So I think we put a lot of issues on the table for everyone to think about it. We've done our job on this topic, okay? Thank you very much. So go home and reflect on this, people. This would be great. Indigenous Crown relationship. Ann McLellan's going to start us on this one. In recent years, there have been significant developments in the relationship between the Crown and First Nations governments. In 2007, the UN released its Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Since that time, the Canadian government has also released its Truth and Reconciliation Report in 2015 and the final report on the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls in 2019. The question is, what are the key lessons to draw from these documents and processes? In the medium term, how do you envision Crown First Nation relations, and how do we get there from here?
Look, this is one of the most complex issues that we as a society and governments at all levels will deal with. I think the first thing we take away from those processes and other things, including court decisions, is that Indigenous people have rights. And those rights cannot be ignored. And the court has made that plain. Hence, for example, when you're talking about building a pipeline, you have to consult with Aboriginal Canadians if that pipe goes through their land. Now, I take the point that the Supreme Court has not done a great job at defining for us exactly what appropriate and sufficient consultations are. But I keep telling people where I live and everywhere, and people know this, that it is no longer possible to do the bare minimum in terms of the rights of Indigenous people and give them an impact benefit agreement with a little bit of education and a little bit of training and say, then we're all done, now let our pipeline go through your land. That is not good enough, and that's what, perhaps not these documents particularly, but that's what this framework is helping us to understand. Indigenous people have rights, and we have to understand the extent of those rights. We have to be respectful of those rights. We have to take on board a past that has led to the socioeconomic devastation of many of our First Nations communities, and we need to work with those communities now in a constructive way to help them rebuild. And it's not for us, whether it's through the Indian Act or anything else, to tell them in terms of what is necessary culturally and otherwise to rebuild too many destroyed communities and lives. Murdered and Missing Women, that commission actually, they took a rights framework to what they determined. We know that there are too many Aboriginal women who have gone missing and have been murdered. There are a host of issues involved with that inquiry, but the context of it was rights. And in fact, it was rights, and they identified human rights violations in relation to culture, health, security, and justice. And I think we can all in our own universes take on board what those violations were. There are no easy answers and the Murdered and Missing Women's inquiry does not suggest there are easy answers. Again, so much of what has gone wrong for Indigenous people is the destruction of their culture and the destruction of sustainable, or not the creation perhaps, in many cases, of sustainable socioeconomic opportunities. And I just think that we, as with climate change, we are at a tipping point in terms of not only the Crown's relationship with Indigenous people, our relationship, the Canadian society, each one of us is an individual, our relationship with Indigenous peoples in this country. And it's hard and it's frustrating sometimes. You have no idea how frustrating it can be sometimes if you're sitting in Alberta and you think you've consulted with good faith and in an ethical way, but the court tells you, no, there's more to do. And we have to work together, not to become so impatient and frustrated that this breaks down the threads of civil society. We have to understand the past and the consequences of a colonial past and build stronger threads together. But it's not us any longer, as we used to do, telling an Aboriginal community what they need, what is best for them. It is, in fact, working with that community in a spirit of collaboration to ensure we understand what they need, so that they have the same socioeconomic opportunities as most other Canadians. This is long-haul stuff, ladies and gentlemen. This is not easy, but if we do not do it, I think our civil society will fray at the edges, and that would be tragic in almost more ways than I can think.
Darrell.
Well, I agree. I don't think that government should be in a position of choosing which rights they're going to enforce and which rights they're going to ignore.
Right.
I think the time there was never a time for that, but it's well and truly past. What I believe we need is a national reconciliation plan, one that is done collaboratively. It's got to be rooted in the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And it needs to come with a mechanism that actually reports on progress.
Yes.
So some kind of a National Reconciliation Council of some sort. Once the report comes forward, you actually monitor it. You report regularly to Parliament and to the people of Canada on how you're going to achieve the goals of the plan.
Jan? So Peter, sorry, you said.
And I embrace all that's been said. This is a very difficult past to reconcile, but I think more than that, we've done the retrospective. We have the reports.
Yeah.
I can tell you that the reports at the Department of Justice are not few. There are many, and there are many recommendations that we have not acted on. So it's deeds, not words. And that is what I think has brought about a lot of the cynicism, and I think we're starting to see more and more of this fraying that Anne referred to. And so, like the communities and like the issues that we've been discussing here and like the regions, there are specific problems that need to be addressed first. Violence on reserve, absolutely. Let's forget about oil and gas pipelines. Let's talk about water pipelines. We have the most water of any country in the world, and yet we have boil water orders on reserve in many parts of the country. So surely we can get on with addressing some of those issues. Health issues in the north, which is again a whole other massive part of our country that is both under-resourced and challenged and most affected by climate change, and we're not there to the extent that we should be. We don't have the presence. We have Arctic Rangers that put our First Nations in uniform, and they're being the eyes and ears of what's happening in the north. We need to listen to them. We need to look to them for some of the answers. Canada has a well-deserved, stellar reputation internationally for doing development and going to places, and in Afghanistan was the example that I was exposed to, where we would go into the little villages and communities around Afghanistan and say, what do you need? What's your priority project? As opposed to other countries that went in and said, right, here's what we're doing, get out of the way, we're going to put this in place, we're building that. Listening and working collaboratively is a big part of it, but we are now going to have to restore some of that faith with action. It's not enough to say, and I'm not trying to be provocative, that we were privileged. It's not enough to say that we're going to put people in various positions and empower them to do it. We have to actually do it and give them the power in many cases to make those decisions.
Do it with
And that means
our help.
accountability on reserve as well, and having a First Nations Transparency Act.
Because I want to get to our last question.
So I would just like to say I think the Trudeau government did a good thing in separating the mandate
Two departments.
two departments. So one department that is focused on all of those problems: water, healthcare, child welfare, all of those things, perfectly aligned for somebody to, let's just tackle this. The separate issue is Indigenous Crown relations, and that's a whole other question, and you can't wait for one or the other. They both have to go forward. I would just step back to the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which really, George Erasmus and René Dussault laid out a blueprint for systemic change towards self-determination. Voluminous report, and ultimately, what it points to is the fact that the Indian Act is a racist law, and that ultimately it's got to go, and that the goal has got to be self-determination, and the federal government has not embraced that. I think that's why these reports don't go anywhere, is because it gets back to that. The federal government hasn't embraced self-determination for Indigenous people, nor have provincial governments. And until that happens, we're just going to be cherry-picking, little things that are easy to do, and we can check the boxes. But the bigger question of Indigenous Crown relations, I think, is embedded in that question of self-determination. And that's where UNDRIP comes in, right?
And it's embedded in a lot of federal laws. I mean, it was in the Marital Act. It's in a lot of areas of legislation that are outdated, that have become anachronistic. We have to update a lot of the ways in which we interact with our First Nations. Having people on reserve, I mean, how bizarre and outdated is that? I mean, how can they feel that they are truly embraced when they're on the margins of so many of the communities that we live in?
But Peter, you and I
they
both
need
know there are
land.
practical challenges within the communities themselves. Because if you and I were speaking not to this audience, but to an audience of chiefs from 600 communities across the country, the group would be divided almost 50-50 in
Correct.
terms of those who want the Indian Act gone and those who don't. Right?
Right.
And there are different motivations for both keeping it and wanting it gone.
And the rights
And-
that you spoke
and
of
the
are
ri-
embedded in it
exa-
to some degree.
To some degree. So that this is a complex governance issue in that within the communities themselves, there has to be, I suppose, better governance to some extent, but in engagement around these difficult issues. I can assure you, and I think Mr. Harper and you would have said the same thing, if we could get rid of the Indian Act, we would. We would. But there was never sufficient consensus, and we felt that we might do more harm getting rid of it because this audience would be 50-50, right? So nobody should pretend that these are easy solutions to complex generational questions. And yes, sometimes it can become bureaucratic and we get bogged down and you say, why doesn't government do more? But in this area, we have to listen so much better than we have been and take on board that getting rid of the Indian Act may work for some people right now today, but getting rid of the Indian Act for some other communities in this country could do profound harm.
Right. Sweeping change
Let's,
often
So
does.
we have to be more thoughtful in relation to our relationships with Indigenous people and hopefully be able to take our cue from them in most of the important areas.
Let's pause on that one. We're down to our last question, which I really want to throw out, even though I'm getting bullets stared at me right now in terms of our time. So I'm gonna go on this one very, very quickly because I want to get an answer from our panelists on this. Janice will start us, but we're going to go along everybody very quickly and maybe 30-second reflection on this last question for each person. Oh, come on. Let's not start off laughing. I'm doing my best here. We've seen a huge movement. This is a very simple question, though. This is a very simple question. We've seen a huge movement take hold in Europe among young people concerned about the environment. This concern is exemplified best by Greta Thunberg, the teenage activist from Sweden who sailed across the Atlantic to raise climate change issues in the UN. In her words, quote, "Since our leaders are behaving like children, we will have to take the responsibility they should have taken long ago," end quote. Barack Obama last week described her as one of the planet's greatest advocates. I also think about the work of Pakistani Malala Yousufzai, who was shot by the Taliban at 16 because of her activism on girls and education. She went on to be the youngest recipient of the Nobel Prize. Neither of these young women, Thunberg presently and Yousufzai at the time she was shot, would be allowed to vote in our system because they would be too young. The question is, should we lower the voting age to 16?
Easy.
The panelists first, please.
Easy for me. So I'm married to David Kuhn, the first Green MLA in New Brunswick. And the first bill that he introduced in this, when the legislature opened, and was, to everyone's surprise, to lower the voting age to 16.
So the answer is yes.
The answer is yes, and the positive feedback on that surprised everybody to the extent that, and this is a longer story, which you're telling me I don't have time to tell, but the Liberal government on second reading voted for it because they got such feedback from young people to the MLAs, and they literally did not dare to defeat the bill on second reading.
Peter?
Now, it since died. They let it die. But I think that was what sparked this debate in the Maritimes. It became, you know, Maritime Noon has done phone-ins on it a couple of times. But what I've seen is just on these, there's 2 Maritime Noon phone-ins, one early, one more recent. Early, everybody thought it was the craziest idea in the world. What David Kuhn is wasting all of his legislative time. More recently, the vast majority of people support it.
Peter.
I'm uncomfortable with it. I'll admit I used to be very much in favor of lowering the voting age. Now I think that the emphasis should be on education and ensuring that you're talking and having these civic discussions at an earlier age and making sure that the curriculums include real discussions on democracy and freedom and the rule of law, as opposed to simply throwing, you know, young people into a situation where, quite frankly, you know, in the current state, I'm not sure that that would really shape the outcome. We're having a hard time getting 21-year-olds out to vote. Lowering the voting age, to me, seems like a bit of a simplistic response. Malala was shot because she was trying to get more girls educated. And so we take a lot for granted in this country. We have access to education, but we don't necessarily, I think, embrace some of the broader civics discussions around responsibilities. Places like Australia, Argentina, they fine you if you don't vote. So there's other incentives that you can look at.
Anne.
It's not a hill I'm going to die on, but my inclination is to say no. 16 is too young. 18 to 25-year-olds before the 2015 election only voted 15%. That's 18 to 25-year-olds. It went up to 47% in the 2015 election.
Electoral reform and marijuana.
Yeah, you got it. Well, we did get that cannabis thing done, didn't we?
Good stuff.
But what in fact I would say is that I think whether it's 18 or 16, these are arbitrary decisions. As far as I'm concerned, I do think as a society what we need to look at is what is the age at which we believe someone is a young adult and can take up many responsibilities and aspects of civic responsibility. 18 presently, but as I say, right now, I think I've got bigger issues to work on than whether we drop the age to 16.
Darrell.
Well, you mentioned that 18 is arbitrary, so I never understood what the difference between 17, 364 days was and 18, you know, so you can march it back as far as you like. But when you're 16, you can drive a car. You walk across the crosswalk in front of a 16-year-old driving a car. You trust him to do that or her to do that. Why wouldn't you trust a 16-year-old to vote?
Okay.
I'm not sure.
I think we're essentially out of time, but I'm hoping we get just a couple of questions from the floor and before. We got some time for a couple
Graduated
of floor
licenses,
questions? Yeah, okay. This gentleman here on the far right. The far right, not the far right, but he's sitting to the right, yes.
The fast food sector would collapse without 16-year-old workers.
So I want to reopen the energy debate because that clearly wasn't an entertaining enough segment of this conversation. 55% of our province is currently powered by coal, yet there's a climate strike on Friday. Why are we so divided on this issue?
I don't really think we are divided on the issue. The reality is there has been a consensus around the need to get off of fossil fuel. It goes back quite a long ways in the electricity sector. The problem has always been the cost associated with that transition. And Peter would know, and others who have followed this issue would know that, in fact, the Environment Act mandated the closure of the coal-fired generating stations in Nova Scotia over a specific period of time. The problem with the way in which the act was worded was it was going to strand $1 billion in invested capital in the utility, which was then going to be passed on to the ratepayers. So that's why Nova Scotia has an equivalency agreement with the federal government, first signed with the Conservatives and then renewed with the Liberals, in order to say we recognize that Nova Scotia has a program of decarbonizing the electricity grid in Nova Scotia. I expect that that's going to continue to go on. May not be as fast as everybody would like, certainly not as fast as I would like, but it is happening.
Other thoughts on
Canada's
this?
going to be out of the coal business in terms of production of energy very soon. And even Donald Trump in the United States can't stop that happening. There are just no economics left in the United States around staying in the coal business as a generator of power. So all this infrastructure will be either refurbished and converted to natural gas or whatever the case may be. But coal is quite literally going to be a dinosaur.
Except in China and except in Russia.
I wanna-
And
I
that's a
wanna
whole
go
other
to
part of
the-
the
That
issue.
is true,
But you're right
but
to
it's
suggest it can become emotional, and I think issues around the environment do tend to become emotional because there's a sense of urgency. But it's massive infrastructure investment, as the Premier said, as Darrell said, and we should be burning more natural gas in Atlantic Canada. This big sucking noise that we hear, it's sable gas leaving our province.
It left
And we're
already,
not,
Peter.
It
I-
left
I-
already, but we should be connected to that infrastructure. But again, it's a lot of
I
money
want
to
to
build.
take a question. This gentleman right here, please go ahead.
Yeah, so just taking it from Peter MacKay, I realize that climate change, it seems to be consensus on it, but there seem to be mixed messages from politicians. This is public forum, but once you leave here, the politicians sort of send mixed messages as to whether climate change is important or not, or even what or not is real. And some of the people who say that are very influential and are likely to really influence a lot of people as to the way they think about climate change. And we've heard that recently in very key, high-profile politicians here making really controversial statements about environmental activists and climate change. The same with immigration. So we know it's important, but there's always, really very, interesting mixed messages coming out of very influential people. So how do we balance that and, really walk the talk so that when we speak in public, when we go behind closed doors, we still mean what we said?
I think it's the actions. And look, I'm a recovering politician, but I heard Brian Mulroney last week when he was speaking at the opening of this Mulroney Institute at St. Yves, no disrespect to Dal,
None
but
taken.
another good school, along with Acadia and St. Mary's. And there I am being a politician again.
University
But-
of King's College.
I mean, Brian Mulroney walked the walk on a lot of things. It was agreed by Elizabeth May, of all people, of the Green Party and Sierra Club and Greenpeace, that he was the greenest prime minister because he did certain things. He walked the walk. He said things perhaps privately, but publicly, he went and convinced the Americans to sign on to an acid rain treaty. He helped convince Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan to end apartheid. So it's action, I think, that people are looking for now more than anything from any of the leaders from any of the parties. And Mulroney himself called everybody out last week. He says, if environment isn't front and center in this election, there will be a cost to pay at the ballot box. And he's right.
I think he actually didn't say environment, he said climate change. There will be a price to pay. And I just give him full 100% support for saying that.
Okay.
Well, conserve is in the Conservative Party.
This lady here, go ahead, please.
Hi. As I'm standing here, I want to talk about China, but I'm too afraid. So I'll leave you to guess because I worry about my own safety as well as my relatives. Why am I afraid? Because in August 18th, right here in Halifax, outside the farmers market, I witnessed a group of about 100 Chinese patriots waving Chinese flags, singing Chinese anthems, and intimidating pro-democracy protesters on the other side of the street. In fact, only a few pro-democracy protesters showed up because there were threats on the internet towards the protests, and many worry that something bad may happen. Therefore, my biggest concern is, has Nova Scotia become a weak link in Canada's defense against constitution infringement by the Chinese government, allowing her to monitor and even oppress democracy-loving Chinese Canadians who still have ties in Canada? Also, should our government consider one's belief in universal values as an important screening factor for immigration into the province or into the country? More specifically, should Nova Scotia favor democracy-loving applicants over pro-dictatorship applicants.
Boy, that's a question. Mhm.
Who wants to take that one?
Yes, I'm all for democracy. You know, if we're going to, and the challenge, of course, through the emotional laden issues around immigration is if you start saying we're going to call it a Canadian values test, we know where that goes. But you're right to be concerned about China. I mean, when they're oppressing Uyghurs, when Falun Gong are being, you know, disappeared and prosecuted, and when you see elements of that protest showing up in Canada, it's alarming and it's jarring. It concerns me that we could see interference in this upcoming election. We have Canadians on death row in China. We have 2 Canadians who were arbitrarily arrested and are being held. And we still haven't been able to make much headway in all of that. And perhaps what I consider to be very alarming, we're thinking of turning over our 5G network to China, to Huawei, who are a state-run enterprise. There'll be no more intellectual property protection. There will be no data protection, and we'll be thrown out of the Five Eyes. So there are big, big implications for how we react to China. We should be taking them to the WTO for what they're doing to our ag sector. We should be pushing back at every level, and we should be calling them out. We should be vocally supporting the protesters in Hong Kong. We should absolutely be advocating for democracy. Any form of democracy is better than what China has right now.
Last comments on China?
I'd like to hear from Darrell on the question about Nova Scotia being a weak link.
Well, I'm not sure how. I don't want to pick on poor old Nova Scotia. The reality is that these same issues arise in all of the provinces across the country.
Big protests in BC.
It's not just here in Nova Scotia, but what is absolutely a fundamental Canadian value is the respect for freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. No one should feel threatened or feel that they aren't able to express themselves in a public forum without the fear of retribution. If that is happening, it should not be, and there are methods that we have for ensuring that it doesn't happen. But I agree with Peter. China is a very difficult problem to deal with because the way in which the state operates is, so insidious around the world. And it was the one place in the world where I went on a trade mission where, I'll share this little tidbit, they told me, when you have your cell phone, don't just turn it off, take the battery out, because they will turn it on and they will listen to you.
And pull all the information out.
Oh, absolutely. So, you get these kinds of warnings and briefings when you're traveling to China. So we know these issues are very profound.
I think we're going to have to bring it to a close. We could have made it a sleepover. Everyone could have brought their sleeping bags and pillows. We could have gone on for several hours. First off, please join me in thanking the panelists for their contributions. One thing that I can absolutely predict for the future of the people in the Atlantic Canadians in this room is there's no glass of wine in your near future because we don't have a liquor license in this building that we can provide it at our reception. However, we do have a reception plan. There are soft drinks available and there are finger foods, and there's an opportunity for you to further question our panelists because they will be at the reception. So please join us at the reception, if you have, which is upstairs. I think it's, if you go to the back, it's up one flight of stairs. If you come down this way, it's up 2 flights. I think it's up 2 flights that way, or it's this way in the elevator up 2. What I would ask that you not do is come down and speak to the panelists here, because they'll never get to the reception. This is a trick I learned from Chris Stover at SESEPA. For those of you who know who Chris Stover is at the Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs, she always said, don't let people come to the front because they never get to the reception. So please allow them to come to the reception. And if you have any questions at all or comments at all about this particular event, we'll be sending out an email for those who registered. Otherwise, email is mipp@dow.ca. And I think that's probably all I have to. Oh, and finally, of course, thank you to Tari Ajadi and Caitlin Lowe for keeping us somewhat honest on the timing. Tari wasn't impressed. They have some tokens of our appreciation for our panelists. So thanks again.